Before Roman Reigns became the tribal chief, before Seth Rollins became the visionary, they were brothers. Three men in tactical vests, walking through crowds together, taking down anyone who stood between them, and total control of WWE, the Shield. And standing across from them was a different kind of power. Evolution. Triple H, Ric Flair and Randy Orton, with Batista as the enforcer, an entire era of WWE's past standing in the way of its future. Those matches, in 2013 and 2014, weren't just some of the best tag team wars WWE ever produced. They were the exact moment Roman Reigns and Seth Rollins first learned how to fight beside each other, and eventually how to fight against each other, because not long after Evolution fell, the Shield fell too. Rollins turned. And what started as a betrayal became a rivalry that would last over a decade, one where, no matter what Roman Reigns accomplished, one man always seemed to have his number, until this past weekend. This is the story of how a bond forged in war against Evolution became one of WWE's longest-running rivalries, and how, after more than 10 years, Roman Reigns finally settled it. To understand why this rivalry carries so much weight, you have to go back to where Reigns and Rollins actually started, not as enemies, but as two-thirds of the most dominant faction WWE had produced in years. The Shield debuted as an unstoppable outside force, and by 2013, they found themselves locked in an extended war with Evolution, the reformed faction built around Triple H's authority, Ric Flair's legacy, and Randy Orton's championship pedigree, with Batista brought back in as the group's powerhouse enforcer. On paper, it was positioned as new versus old, three relatively unproven talents against a group that between them had defined multiple eras of the company. In practice, the matches between these two factions became some of the most physically dominant multi-man matches WWE had produced in years, culminating in high-profile clashes, including a six-man match at WrestleMania XXX, where the Shield's cohesion and aggression were pitted directly against Evolution's experience and power. What made those matches matter wasn't just the in-ring quality, though that was considerable. It was the sense that the Shield had to trust each other completely to survive it. Reigns, Rollins, and Ambrose fought as a single unit against opponents who, individually, were more decorated than all three of them combined. Every big spot in those matches depended on precise timing and total confidence that your partner would be exactly where you needed him to be. The kind of trust that gets forged specifically through shared danger, not simply through being placed on the same roster together. That shared trial by fire is a big part of why what happened next hit as hard as it did, because the Shield didn't stay united. In mid-2014, Seth Rollins turned on his own faction, aligning himself with Triple H and the Authority and attacking both Reigns and Ambrose with a steel chair in one of the most memorable betrayals in modern WWE storytelling. It landed as hard as it did precisely because of everything that had come before it. This wasn't a stranger turning on strangers. It was the same trust built through war against Evolution, being weaponized and used against the two men who had relied on it most. It wasn't just a shift in alliances. It was the end of a brotherhood that had been built specifically through shared combat against Evolution, and it planted the seed for a rivalry between Reigns and Rollins that would stretch across the next decade of both of their careers. What followed wasn't a short program that resolved cleanly. It became one of the most one-sided rivalries in modern WWE history. One-sided, that is, in Rollins' favor. At WrestleMania 31, with Reigns positioned in the main event against Brock Lesnar for the WWE World Heavyweight Championship, it was Rollins who cashed in his Money in the Bank contract in the closing moments, stealing the opportunity away and turning what should have been Reigns' crowning moment into another chapter of Rollins getting the better of him. A year later, at Money in the Bank 2016, Rollins beat Reigns for the WWE Championship directly, adding another notch to a rivalry that increasingly felt lopsided. The pattern continued well beyond that. At the Royal Rumble in 2022, Reigns retained the Universal Championship against Rollins, but only via disqualification, after refusing to release a submission hold and ignoring the referee's count, a technical retention that did nothing to settle the actual question of who was better between them. And as recently as WrestleMania 41, Rollins found himself on the winning side again, defeating both Reigns and CM Punk in a triple-threat main event. By the time these two were done trading blows across nearly every major WWE premium live event format imaginable, the numbers told their own story. Heading into their most recent encounter, Rollins reportedly held a decisive edge in their head-to-head history, and by WWE's own on-screen accounting, Reigns had never beaten Rollins in a singles match at a premium live event. For a performer who spent years being positioned as the dominant force at the top of the company, that was a strikingly persistent blind spot, the one rival who simply would not go away, and who kept finding new ways to get the better of him. That history is exactly what made this year's SummerSlam main event feel so different from the moment it was announced. Coming off a steel cage victory over Braun Breaker at Night of Champions, Rollins inserted himself directly into Reigns' path, citing their long history and his repeated wins over him as justification for demanding a shot at the World Heavyweight Championship. It wasn't framed as a routine title defense. It was framed by both performers and by the commentary team as a rivalry finally reaching its breaking point. Two former brothers, one of whom had never been able to shake the other's shadow in a fair fight. The match itself, held at SummerSlam in Minneapolis, lived up to that framing. Over roughly 33 minutes, Reigns and Rollins took their fight well beyond the ring, brawling through the crowd before returning to ringside, where both men traded devastating counters to each other's signature moves, Shield-style powerbombs through announce tables, callbacks to moves associated with Dean Ambrose, and a sequence of near falls that had the arena reacting as though the outcome was genuinely uncertain until the final seconds. At one point, Rollins somehow kicked out of a spear at the last possible moment, extending the drama even further. In the end, it was Reigns who found the finish, delivering a series of spears, 3 of them, a detail commentary specifically pointed out as a nod to the 3 original members of the Shield, before securing the pinfall in the middle of the ring. For the first time in their long, complicated history, Roman Reigns had beaten Seth Rollins clean, one-on-one at a premium live event, with no disqualification, no cash-in, and no outside interference deciding the outcome. After everything that had gone against him across the previous decade, this was the one column of the record that had remained stubbornly, frustratingly empty, and now it wasn't. What happened after the bell rang mattered just as much as the finish itself. Rather than the usual hostility that had defined so much of their history, Reigns extended his arm toward Rollins, and the two shared a respectful fist bump in the center of the ring, a deliberate callback to a gesture that had defined their time together in the Shield more than a decade earlier. It was presented by both the performers and WWE's own commentary team as a genuine closing of a chapter that had been open for over 10 years, rather than simply another win added to Reigns' resume. For an audience that had watched this rivalry stretch across nearly every major stipulation WWE could offer, that image landed with real weight, not triumphant so much as settled. 2 men finally allowed to stop fighting the same fight over and over again. It's worth sitting with how rare that kind of resolution actually is in WWE storytelling. Rivalries this long usually end quietly, fading out as one performer's push cools off, rather than being deliberately closed out with a definitive, one-on-one finish acknowledged on screen as the real settling of the score. The decision to have Reigns win clean, without any of the usual complications that had defined their previous encounters, suggests WWE understood exactly what this match needed to accomplish. Not just a title defense, but a genuine resolution to one of the promotion's longest-running interpersonal stories. There's also something fitting about where this rivalry began and where it's ended up. It started with 2 men fighting side by side against Evolution, trusting each other completely, in matches that demanded exactly that kind of unity. It included a betrayal that broke that trust entirely. A betrayal so effective that it fueled a full decade of Rollins consistently getting the better of Reigns across nearly every big match format WWE could put them in. And it closed with the same 2 men, exhausted and battered, extending a gesture of respect that had once symbolized their brotherhood in the first place. Few rivalries in WWE history have managed to circle back so directly to their own origin point, using the same visual language from a decade earlier to signal that the story had genuinely come full circle. It also says something about how differently these 2 performers' careers unfolded after the Shield split. Reigns spent years being built into the most dominant on-screen force in the company, holding championships for extended stretches and eventually being positioned as something closer to an untouchable centerpiece of WWE's storytelling. Rollins, meanwhile, carved out his own path as a multiple-time world champion in his own right, but seemed to reserve his best, most decisive performances specifically for matches against Reigns, as though the rivalry itself brought out a version of Rollins that even his own considerable championship resume couldn't fully capture. That's part of what made Rollins' dominance in this particular matchup so remarkable, and part of what makes Reigns finally breaking through feel like it required more than just another good performance. It required settling, something that had followed both men through nearly every major chapter of their individual careers. Whether this really is the final chapter between Roman Reigns and Seth Rollins is something only time will answer. WWE has walked back plenty of final storylines before, and given how much value both performers still bring to the company's biggest shows, a future encounter is never entirely off the table. But as closing chapters go, this one hit the notes it needed to. A decade of frustration, resolved not through a technicality, but through a direct, decisive win that finally answered the question this rivalry had been asking since 2014. So, after everything, the Evolution Wars, the betrayal, the decade of losses, was this the ending Roman Reigns' side of this story deserved? Let me know what you think in the comments.